What if survival had been humanity's cruelest gift? Imagine a world where the 14th century didn't just wound Europe, it erased it. Where the Black Death didn't claim 30% of the population, but 90%. Where entire civilizations vanished in a single generation, and the map of human progress was redrawn in ash and silence. This is not fantasy. This is the story of what nearly was, and what one small change could have made inevitable. In our world, the Black Death arrived in 1347 aboard Genoese trading ships fleeing the Mongol siege of Kaffa. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium carried by fleas on black rats, spread with terrifying speed. Within 5 years, it killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia. In Europe alone, roughly 1/3 of the population perished. Cities became graveyards. Entire villages disappeared. The social order fractured. Feudalism weakened. Labor became valuable. The Renaissance eventually bloomed from the ashes. But history turned on a knife's edge.
The point of divergence, October 1347, Messina, Sicily. In our timeline, local authorities in Messina expelled the infected Genoese ships after only a few days. The plague spread, but slowly enough for some communities to react, quarantine, flee. In this timeline, the ships were allowed to dock for 2 full weeks while officials debated. The rats dispersed deeper into the city's grain stores, the fleas found warmer, denser hosts, and critically, a second strain of the bacterium mutated in the Sicilian heat, becoming airborne for brief periods in enclosed spaces. By the time Messina's authorities acted, it was already over. The new strain spread not just through flea bites, but through breath, through prayer, through the final gasps of the dying. Europe didn't just fall ill, it suffocated. 1348 to 1352, the Great Erasure. Within 18 months, the plague reached every corner of Europe. But this time, there were no survivors' tales of resilience, no communities that somehow endured. The mortality rate climbed from 30% to 50%, then 70%, then higher. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence, once home to hundreds of thousands, counted their survivors in the hundreds. The papal city of Avignon, where 70,000 once lived, recorded fewer than 3,000 souls by 1350. Entire regions simply went silent. No smoke rose from villages, no bells rang. Travelers crossing France reported riding for days without seeing a single living person. The clergy, who tended the sick, died first, then the physicians, then the merchants who fled, carrying the plague to new lands. The nobility, locked in their castles, starved when their servants perished. By 1352, Europe's population had collapsed from approximately 75 million to fewer than 8 million. 90% gone. 1353 to 1400, the Hollow Continent. What remains when a civilization dies but doesn't disappear? Empty cities, overgrown roads, libraries with no one left to read them, cathedrals echoing with wind instead of hymns. The survivors faced a world that had become alien. Entire professions vanished. There were no guilds, no universities, no trained craftsmen. A blacksmith in Germany might be the last person alive who knew how to forge steel properly. A scribe in Spain might possess the only copy of Aristotle for 1,000 miles. Agriculture collapsed. Without enough hands to work the fields, famine followed plague. Domesticated animals, cattle, horses, sheep, either died or went feral. Wolves reclaimed the forests. Wild boar roamed through what had once been Paris. The survivors clustered in small, desperate communities, often no larger than 50 people. They scavenged the ruins of the old world, wearing dead men's clothes, eating from abandoned granaries, sleeping in houses where entire families had perished. Language itself began to fragment. Isolated groups developed their own dialects within a single generation. Latin, the common tongue of the educated, was now known only to a handful of aging priests.
The Eastern Shift, 1360 to 1450. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does power. While Europe choked on its own dead, the Islamic world and Asia had been affected far less severely by this particular strain. The Ottoman Empire, already expanding, now faced no meaningful resistance. By 1365, Ottoman forces had crossed the Bosporus not to conquer a rival civilization, but to occupy an empty one. Constantinople fell in 1368, not to siege, but to simple occupation. There was no one left to defend it. The Ottomans moved through the Balkans, Greece, Italy. They found ruins, not armies, marble cities with populations in the dozens. Churches converted to mosques not through conquest, but through inheritance. By 1400, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Baghdad to the Atlantic coast of Portugal. They didn't build an empire through war, they inherited a graveyard and slowly brought it back to life.
But something had been lost that could never be recovered: continuity. The survivors of the plague knew their parents' world had been greater, but they didn't know how. They lived among the ruins of cathedrals they couldn't build, read books in languages they couldn't fully understand, used tools they couldn't replicate. The knowledge wasn't just lost, it was scattered into 1,000 fragments, each held by isolated communities with no way to share it. When a Syrian scholar arrived in Naples in 1453, he found the remnants of a great library, thousands of texts in Latin, Greek, Arabic, but there were only 12 people left in the city who could read any language at all, and none of them could read all three. The Renaissance, which in our world ignited in the 15th century, never came. There was no critical mass of scholars, no wealthy patrons, no cities large enough to support universities. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg in our timeline around 1440, was never developed because there was no one left who remembered how to cast metal type consistently, and no market large enough to justify the investment. Humanity began again, but from a point centuries behind where it had been.
1500 to 1600, the New Dark Age. By the turn of the 16th century, Europe, now the western provinces of the Ottoman Empire, had recovered to a population of approximately 20 million, still only a quarter of what it had been in 1340. But the culture had changed fundamentally. The Mediterranean had become an Islamic lake. Arabic and Turkish were the languages of trade and learning. Christianity survived only in isolated pockets, rural communities in the Alps, hidden monasteries in Scandinavia, scattered believers in what had once been Germany. China, largely spared from the worst of the plague, became the world's dominant technological power. By 1550, Chinese fleets had mapped the Pacific, established trade routes with the Americas, and developed early firearms and mechanical printing that would have seemed miraculous to the scattered survivors of Europe. 1600 to 1700, the question of progress. In this world, the Enlightenment never happened. Science advanced, but slowly, irregularly, without the explosive growth that characterized our 17th and 18th centuries. There was no Newton, because there was no Cambridge to train him, no Galileo, because there was no Italian city-state wealthy enough to fund his observations, no Descartes, because France was now a patchwork of rural communities speaking half a dozen languages, united only by Ottoman administration. Philosophy changed too. The dominant intellectual tradition became Islamic rationalism, blended with Chinese Confucian thought, a focus on harmony, stability, and the preservation of knowledge, rather than revolutionary discovery. The population grew slowly. By 1700, the former territories of Europe held perhaps 40 million people, still half what they'd contained in 1340, 4 centuries earlier. But something else had changed. Something harder to measure. The survivors had inherited a world of ghosts. They lived in cities built for millions, with populations in the thousands. They worked fields that had once fed a continent. They passed ruins every day, castles, cathedrals, universities that reminded them we were once more than this. The weight of absence. Imagine the art that was never created. The music that was never composed, the scientific discoveries that came centuries late, or not at all. In our world, the Black Death's aftermath led to labor shortages that weakened feudalism, empowered workers, and eventually contributed to the rise of individual rights and democracy. In this world,
There weren't enough survivors for such social forces to matter. Power consolidated instead of distributing. Those who controlled food and security became absolute rulers by necessity, not ambition. The world still turned. Civilizations still rose. But humanity had been severed from its own past in a way that could never fully heal. Every generation knew they stood on the ruins of something greater. Every scholar who found an ancient text in a language no one could fully read was reminded, "We have forgotten more than we have learned."
Epilogue, 1750. By the mid-18th century, the global population had finally recovered to pre-plague levels. The Ottoman Empire had fragmented into regional powers. China's maritime dominance had waned. New kingdoms had emerged in the former heartlands of Europe. But the trajectory of human civilization had been permanently altered. The Industrial Revolution, powered in our world by European scientific advancement and colonial wealth, came late and tentatively, beginning in China around 1780 rather than England in 1760. Democracy, individual rights, the printing press, the scientific method, all of these emerged eventually, but centuries behind schedule, and shaped by very different cultural forces. And in the ruins of old Europe, now rebuilt and repopulated, there remained a collective memory, a cultural scar that never fully healed. They had survived, but they had lost something that could never be recovered: the unbroken thread of their own history.
Final reflection. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't death, but interrupted becoming. The Black Death in our timeline was catastrophic, but it left enough survivors to remember, to rebuild, to carry forward the accumulated knowledge of centuries. But if it had taken 90% instead of 30%, humanity wouldn't have died, it would have simply forgotten itself. And in forgetting, it would have had to learn the hardest lesson of all, that civilization isn't just cities and books and tools. It's the unbroken conversation between generations, the inherited memory of what we've learned and who we've been. Break that chain, and even the survivors become orphans in their own world, alive but exiled from their own past. History doesn't repeat, but it remembers. And when it forgets, we all become strangers in a world that was once ours.